Welcome to Inside Admission, the podcast that gives you a behind-the-scenes look at the college admission process with the experts in and around college admission. Welcome to the Inside Admission podcast. I'm Andy Palumbo, your host, and I am thrilled to welcome Jay Jacobs, Vice Provost for Enrollment Management at the University of Vermont. Welcome to the podcast, Jay.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and chat with you.
Absolutely. So this is the first episode of a series I want to do with several VPs, deans, directors. Questions that we get all the time from students and parents is what actually happens inside the admission committee. And so that's the topic for the day here. Jay and I are going to talk all about what happens behind those closed doors in those cloistered settings, in conference rooms on campus, or on Zoom screens, as the case may be. But before we get into that, I do want to start with just asking Jay, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background in higher ed, how you got into admissions, and what your career path has been like?
Yeah, sure. No problem. I first had somewhat of the itch as a high school senior, actually, going around doing campus tours myself. I knew that wherever I ended up, I told my mother this as I was driving back from a college visit at one point, that I wanted to be the student giving the tours. So shortly after I got on campus, I tried to find out how to make that happen. And the latter half of my first year at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, I applied to be and was accepted to be a tour guide. As I, spent my 4 years in the admissions office at St. Lawrence, I saw a number of upperclassmen students go off into higher ed, admissions or res life or student affairs or what have you. And I always thought that it was just such a cop out. I was sitting there paying like $160,000 or whatever it was at the time for my 4-year economics degree. So I wanted to try that out for size. If you look at my background and resume, what you won't find on there is I did a couple of months stint after I graduated from St. Lawrence doing business to business sales for Verizon. Hated every second of it, and called up the dean of admissions at St. Lawrence, who was at the time, who was and still is a close mentor of mine, Terry Cowdery, because I knew that a college campus was where I felt most comfortable and where I wanted to be, and wanted to pick her brain about how to get into a full-time admissions job. So I did just that and landed my first admissions job at the College of New Jersey, doing in-state recruitment for TCNJ, coordinating their merit scholarship program with another great female mentor of mine, Kay DeCino. And it kind of took off from there, right? I knew that I had made the right choice. I was lucky enough at 23 or whatever it was to know that this was a career path that I wanted to stay on. And I invested in myself and went to Drexel University's master's program. And from there, hopped around. There's the adage in our industry, in order to move up, you have to move out. And I certainly did that with stints at Colgate University in upstate New York. I did a stint doing MBA admissions at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Then made my way to the University of Miami down in South Florida. And then just this past, 2 Januaries ago now, made my way up to Burlington and at the University of Vermont.
It's funny. I didn't know your story, Jay, but you and I are like career doppelgangers. I did business to business sales for a Fortune 500 company right when I got out of my alma mater union, and I lasted 9 months before I got fired. I would say I was not the hardest working employee there. I missed a sales quota, but I'm curious, how many months did you last?
It might have been right around that same time, Andy. Maybe a little less. I'm trying to remember the full details. I pulled out. I was like, like I said, I hated putting the tie on and shaving every day and going to that job. Like you, having the quota in the back of my mind, just like, killed me every single day, week, month, whatever the quota number was. And um, I ended up quitting and serving tables for, I don't know, 4 or 5 months before I got the full time admissions job.
Well, you were more productive than I was. I was collecting unemployment watching the World Cup. So
Hey,
applying to jobs. But
to each his own.
so it's funny. It's funny the things we find out when we ask questions like that. So I'm curious. You touched on a little bit, but could you talk a little bit about your own college search process? What were you valuing? What did it look like? What was your high school like? Who were the key supports in your process?
Sure. I'm a graduate of Fairport High School in the suburbs of Rochester, New York. Um, you know, upper middle class neighborhood, 99% white, very suburban place. Um, while I was looking at schools, I was probably looking within, I don't know, a 5 or 6 hour radius from home. Like I knew that I wasn't getting on a plane and going anywhere or anything like that. I would say academic program kind of was kind of that first, checkbox that I was looking for. Like I said, I ended up being an economics major. So I knew I was looking at business or economics or something like that. Um, I knew I wanted a small place that I could feel like it would be a home away from home. Um, extracurricular involvement, clubs and organizations like that weren't a huge driving factor. I knew I would be able to get involved and find friends. That's just kind of the kind of person we are in admissions at times, these like extreme off the chart extroverts. Um, I did play lacrosse in high school. I knew that, I would be able to play D3 or club wherever I went. Um, if I could play varsity and it checked all my other boxes, that was kind of a bonus. So I applied to, I don't know, I applied to 5 or 6 places. I was admitted to a handful. I was denied from some, and I was waitlisted at some. Um, I was definitely drawn to small liberal arts colleges and college towns. Um, I had tons of support. My parents were um, definitely involved. Um, I had I guess I should put it this way. I had a lot of privilege in the process.
Sure.
My parents were involved, both educated, had the savvy of how to do the college search process. And we had the funds to get in the car and do tours and go visit St. Lawrence or Union or, all the schools in the Boston area and things like that. I also, I went to a public high school, and we had guidance counselors that, the college counseling was like a sliver of what they do, right? But I was lucky enough to have the one guidance counselor, assigned to me who was outstanding, um, a mentor of mine, and kind of put in my head like college guidance counseling would be something that I might want to do in the future. And then another one who worked in the office, who actually is a St. Lawrence alum, and kind of got that on my list eventually. So I had all the help that you can ask for in the process, and I took it for granted at the time. Now that I sit in this seat and the seats I've sat in the industry since, um, you know, I think that's provided a lens for me to make sure that I'm thinking of the students who didn't have all of those opportunities at their fingertips as they go through the process. So um, ultimately, I toured St. Lawrence. I fell in love with St. Lawrence. And I knew that if I got admitted, that was where I was going to go. It certainly wasn't kind of like the highest in terms of pecking order, in terms of rankings or anything like that I even applied to or was even admitted to, but it was the right fit for me. I never regret that choice. I still love St. Lawrence to death, much to the chagrin of the director of admissions here at UVM, one of our big crossover schools. And like I said, I've met mentors like Terry Cowdery. Some of my closest friends are from college. You know how it is. Union is a very similar type of place.
Yeah, absolutely. So When you reflect on that college search process and the help that you had, I'm wondering if you recall that period of time after you submitted your applications and you're waiting. I feel like back when we were applying to college, there were fewer early programs. There was less sort of rolling admission. I mean, I recall waiting 12 years for my college acceptances. I may be a little bit hazy there, but it seemed like a really long time. What do you remember about that time, and what was going through your head?
Yeah, when you pass this question along to me, Andy, I tried to think back to, my 16 or 17-year-old self applying. I don't remember the waiting. I don't remember the waiting like at all. Um, and it's probably because of the privilege I referenced earlier, right? Like I had a really thought out strategy to apply to colleges, and I knew that I was going to go to college. Like that wasn't ever a question, right? So I don't really remember the waiting. I remember really enjoying the process of building my lists and putting my application together and touring colleges and thinking about how a school would fit or meets my needs and how I envision myself on that campus. Um, I do remember. I don't remember a lot about the yield process. I remember going on like recruitment trips for lacrosse. I know for a fact I was waitlisted at Boston College, and Boston College was probably um, my second choice. But once I got into St. Lawrence, I don't even think I put my name on the wait list at BC. Um, and again, a lot of it is because I lived in like this upper class, upper middle class place. I had all of these opportunities to me. I um, I never remember like talking with my parents about like cost. I remember my dad appealing our merit based scholarship at St. Lawrence, but truthfully, like I think that's another indication of the privilege. Like I don't think that the decision that St. Lawrence made was going to make or break our family's decision to enroll there. I think it's just so I don't remember a lot of it. It couldn't have gone smoother for me, and I'm really really lucky for that.
So I think for students who are like me during that process, who are anxiously counting down the days and wondering what takes so long to review my application, I think a big question that they and their parents have, that maybe we as admissions officers are guilty of talking around sometimes at points, is how does that all work? Like I think about it, like when I go to buy a car, it's not that frequent. I feel like you need to like get an education. It's a major purchase. You're trying to figure out all the ins and outs, and then you're in the process, and all of a sudden it's like another world, like and I'm sitting there thinking, I'm like, I just want to know how it works. I know they're getting me, but how does this work? What's happening in the background? And so I think that maybe not as cynical as me when I buy a car, but I think a lot of students and parents want to know what's happening once we hit submit. And so there's a lot to unpack there, I know. So I'll try to sort of feed you some questions as we think about this. But first of all, you're here representing UVM. When you head into an admissions committee, what are you looking for when you're reviewing an applicant? And what does a successful applicant to UVM look like?
Yeah, there is a lot to unpack there. The last question is much easier to answer than the whole process in one bite. But um, a successful applicant at the University of Vermont is a student who is looking to take advantage of a large research university in a small school environment. Right, community is important. They're looking to build both the liberal arts skill sets, right? Problem solving, communication skills, critical thinking skills, etc. Maybe they have interests in pre-professional programs, in our School of Business or engineering and the like, but are buying into kind of those core competencies um, that the liberal arts gives you, um, to succeed in whatever it is you end up being, right? You've seen these studies that
Yep.
those skills that I just rattled off in terms of liberal arts, those are what employers are looking for, right? Um, I mentioned the community. I think community is really important here at the University of Vermont. There's a number of different ways students find their community, whether that is through clubs or organizations or support services here on campus. Our residential learning communities, living and learning with people your first 2 years here on campus around a certain theme. Um, but we are a public flagship institution in the state of Vermont, but we're different, right? Because Vermont is so small. Only 20% or so, plus or minus, of our students are Vermonters. So
Sure.
it's almost like we're a private institution. So our students are coming here to interact with people who are different from them, engage in the global community in really, in my opinion, innovative and entrepreneurial ways, and prepare for their futures efficiently through their 4-year plans here on campus. I think we are known for kind of three kind of tenets. Our work around sustainability and environmentalism is certainly one of those. We're known for our STEM and health sciences types of programs. And then I think, interestingly enough, being in Vermont at a predominantly white institution, our commitment to justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is certainly a central theme here, not only in our cabinet meetings, but also, in the atmosphere and culture here on campus amongst our junior level staff members, students, graduate students, etc. And some of that is because of we have very different types of diversity than where I came from at the University of Miami here in Burlington. But we also have like this big kind of outsized impact on our community around us. But, we have that, I guess I'll call it, reputation nationally. I mean, I think we can think like, Bernie Sanders and Senator Leahy for that kind of stuff. But that outsized impact on the community around us is certainly important, with like this really interesting balance between kind of this laid back, don't take yourself too seriously mentality while delivering a quality, rigorous, and serious curriculum, pedagogy, and process to building bright citizens and community members.
Wow. So, I feel like you just gave us a really comprehensive look at what UVM values, the types of experiences that students get there, and the admissions office has to translate that into or translate high school credentials, recommendations, and an essay into this student will be a good fit here. And so that's only compounded by the fact that I did some research here. Last year UVM received over 25,000 applications. Only 3,000 students enroll. I think what happens in between is really the mystery there. So, first, I guess a question we often get is, how much time do you spend reading an average application?
It's probably, you hear the stat all the time of 8 to 10 minutes per read per application. That is probably what I personally spend on an application at a school where I know, and I don't need to research all the context, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for our greener admission staffers, it might take them a little bit longer, or for even a veteran staffer going into a new market, it might take them a little bit longer to really understand the context of that student in that community. But what I'll say here, is there are multiple rounds of those 8 to 10 minute reads. So it's not just me looking at it. Plus the countless of times we look at our pool, at large, and shape it, much like what the process Jeff Salingo, one of your prior guests, wrote in his book, Who Gets In and Why, and the committee and shaping processes he explained at those three institutions. Not to mention, right, the countless of hours that our teams go through to build those relationships out on the ground, out in the territory or here on campus, um, um, questions that the candidates are calling or emailing us with, so it's not just the application, but if you only look at that, it's probably an 8 to 10 minute read.
So you mentioned context, and it's so critically important in what we do. A lot of people will hear these buzzwords repeated by admissions officers: holistic review, context. Can you explain what those mean to you and to UVM for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think those two buzzwords that you said, Andy, holistic and context, you can't have one without the other. We often hear
Right.
about holistic, like, oh, holistic means we're going to read every part of your application, which is absolutely true. But it misses the big part of the equation, which is context. So holistic, we're going to look at the whole person. We're going to look at everything that you send us, whether we require it or not, right? Um, but holistic at the highest level means we're going to do that within context of the opportunities that you had um, at your high school, in your community, to determine, are you taking the fullest advantage of those opportunities. So there's a lot of conversations right now in the test optional world of, um, does that mean AP scores get uh, more heavily weighted in the admissions process? Well, sure, maybe, if you go to a school that offers those types of courses, right? So, like, how could we ding you or um, more favorably weight someone who took 5 AP courses at a school that offers 20 versus that student who took 5 at a school that offers 5, right? So it's all about kind of that context around you.
So, and I think one of the questions, you brought up privilege, and I'm curious to hear you talk about how privilege shows up in this process. I think there are a lot of parents, especially, but certainly students too, who feel like, we invested a lot of money in school ABC, or we worked really hard to take as many AP courses as possible, or selected, this school because of the rigorous curriculum. And I think sometimes people hear that explanation of context and they say, well, how's that fair? I did everything and more that student B did. I'm student A. I want what's mine. I've earned this. How do you answer that? How do you talk with a student or a parent who looks at this process and says, how's a sliding scale fair at all?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And, like you and like me, as parents, we're going to make those tough decisions and invest in our children so that we set them up on the best path towards success as possible, right? Um, Not every parent has that opportunity to set their kid up on that path. So I would explain it as, we are not um, we are not um, counting against the student who had the privilege like I had, right? But we are, in context, understanding what that student took advantage of. And if you have the opportunity to take advantage of more, then we will expect more out of you, right? Um, Maybe a better way to explain it to parents is applying it to the workplace. You're at your job, Andy, and your boss, the president of WPI, loves what you're doing. He or she will then raise that bar of expectations on you, right? Because you're doing so good here, you need to get up to this level. And that's what I look for in a boss. That's what I would do for my children. That's what I do for my employees. And I think that is the one way that we can explain it to parents that applies it back to their lives and say, oh, of course that's reasonable. I expect a lot out of my team or my kids or my, what have yous. And the admission offices at UVM or WPI or anywhere else should do the same for my child.
Enjoying the podcast? Like and subscribe to this YouTube video. You can also find us on the web at insideadmissionpodcast.com And you can find and engage with us on social media, where our handle is Inside Admission on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Now, back to the pod.
So you're doing this holistic review within context. You're considering students' credentials versus the opportunities that they've had. Where do you start? What's the first thing you look at when you start an application? What's in the middle? What's last? How do you walk us through that?
I always look for that context first. So as you're filling out the common application or coalition or any application, you're likely asked a handful of demographic type of questions first. I'll look at those if they're not on the card right in front of me. Who are you? How do you identify? What school do you go to? These kinds of things. Once I have kind of a general sense of that context, then I'll start with the transcript. I'll look at courses that you're involved in, how you're doing in those courses, any trends in terms of how you're performing in those classes, up or down or flat, the types of courses that you're taking. Again, trends, are you starting with college prep courses and by the end of your senior year, you're taking more advanced level courses, up or down or, flat, et cetera. If it's a school I don't know about, I'll have to do some more research on that context, right? And look at the high school profile that is sent with every application, I don't know, anywhere from a 1 to a 4 or 5 page document that tells us what those opportunities at the school were that your child could or had the opportunity to take advantage of. If the profile doesn't help me, I might go to the counselor letter of recommendation next, and test scores if applicable. So kind of the academic side of the house first. Then I'll read through the rest of the application, your extracurricular activities, your essays, any additional information, that kind of stuff. The last, required piece that I would look at is letters of recommendation from teachers. And then finally, anything we didn't ask for that you sent in, right? A resume, portfolios, that kind of stuff.
Great. And so you mentioned there's a couple rounds. So what's the minimum number of rounds or reviewers that an application would see? And what do those rounds look like? So I think we've heard sort of you as a first reviewer reading an application from a school maybe you visited or that you're familiar with, and you do this thorough 8 to 10 minute read, and then you do what? Do you share any information with someone? Is it a blind second review? Walk us through that process.
Yeah, we here at the University of Vermont, the territory manager, the admission officer who knows your high school best, will read your application first and provide, take notes and provide context and give kind of a preliminary recommended decision. Then it would move on to one other person here at UVM, who is the liaison for the school or the undergraduate school or college that your student's applying to. So after we look at all this stuff, how do you fit in the rest of the pool for our Rubenstein School of Environmental and Natural Resources or our Grossman School of Business, or et cetera? From there, it depends. You could go off into the committee world, which, would be kind of the old traditional model of committee. Again, it kind of explained in Jeff's book, a small group of counselors getting together to focus on a certain segment of our population. It could be Vermonters, it could be a specific school or college or something like that. And then the admission officer, who's the territory manager, would present that candidate's case to this other small group of admission officers. So, each application at minimum 2 reads, likely 3 or 4, if you include that committee conversation as a read.
Okay, great. Paint us a picture for the committee. What does the room look like? How many people are in it? Is that group? Do they have the red pen out, looking to find reasons to say no to students? What does it look like in that room? I think so many people want to understand what happens in committee.
A lot of snacks, a lot of blurry-eyed, 20 somethings in a room discussing hundreds of files a day. Um, uh, you know, yeah, not a red pen, but they're at least making a final recommended decision. No one person in that room is likely going to be the final decision maker. Um, but it's, committee is a slog. There, you have to move a lot of files in and out of the admit pile based off of, you mentioned our numbers. We have big volume these days, as I'm sure you do at WPI, and a lot of and often competing institutional priorities that we need to take into consideration. Um, so I wouldn't call it, necessarily the red pen or a hatchet or anything like that, but it's certainly people with fresh eyes who have never heard the candidacy's story before, providing their input.
And do you have a rough sense of how many applicants, what percentage of your pool ends up going through the committee process?
Oh, that's a really good question. My director of admissions would know that much better than me.
That's okay.
I don't know. I would guess a third.
Yep, it's a third for us. That's interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So, it's. I think it's helpful for people to understand what that volume is. And so, you've got. I'm assuming you've got some people who, made it through the first two rounds and are recommended to be accepted. Some people who didn't
Yes.
make it through, and maybe they're waitlisted, maybe they're deferred, maybe they're going to receive a denial. And then you get students who have run the gauntlet. They've made it through committee. They're accepted. And so finally, these students are completely safe and accepted, and they're going to get good news, right? Or then we get to what you mentioned before, shaping. And so walk us through what shaping is and what it looks like in practice.
Yeah, so the committee will make that final recommendation, and then a few of us on the senior team, a few of the director of admissions, direct reports, and myself, and then I have a director of strategic initiatives who's kind of our data guru. We'll kind of all look at it and we'll say, oh, we need more of this or less of this, or da 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 da. And look at that data with a critical lens, and just kind of shape it. Just like that, right? Like, okay, there's not enough. We need more forestry majors, or we need, we have too many psychology majors, or, whatever the institutional priority of the flavor of the month is during that particular season. Once we finally get that data in a place where we feel comfortable, it kind of freezes, and we run it through our models and determine, okay, based off of who we're hoping to admit, what are our key performance indicators look like? What's our projected yield? What's our number of headcount? What, I have to look at what's our projected net tuition revenue to talk with our president and CFO about, or our discount rate, or things like that. And then, once it kind of passes the full sniff test, you hit the go button like we did on March 4th, and release thousands of admits, and make a whole ton of people excited about their admission to the University of Vermont. And then you're move squarely into yield season and focus in on hosting thousands of admitted students and their families here on our campus, or coming to them in yield receptions across the country, across the world, and look forward to those days. I mean, the yield season is always my favorite. It's fun to see and feel the fruits of your labor, and feel that excitement from admitted students who are excited about this place. And there's gray hairs in my head as we watch deposits come in, right? And you never know who of those admitted students are going to yield, but it's certainly a fun and exciting time.
And so, much like many of us have become, amateur experts in epidemiology over the past couple of years. Sometimes I find that people who've gone through the admissions process once, maybe twice, maybe have helped a child go through the process, fascinatingly become instant experts, where they understand the magic formula or the essay that will get a student into all 7 IVs. Obviously, we know it's a little silly, but there are a lot of arguments out there when we look at test optional conversations, when we look at the Harvard versus SFFA case that talks with precision about who should have been admitted and who should not have been admitted based on standardized test scores. And so I think there's this belief that even in how we talk about standardized tests and their validity scores and their predictive value. But what you described, and no offense, because it looks just like my process, sounds really messy, right? And, there's this strong belief, I think, in out in the world, that college admission in the United States is a meritocracy, that the best students should be admitted. Can you talk about this a little bit and your perspective on this?
Yeah. I think there is a meritocracy at WPI. There is a meritocracy at UVM. Our definitions of meritorious is probably different, right? So I mean, are the most meritorious students being admitted? Like, yes and no, right? The best students for my institution are different than the best students for your institution. So, and different than what the students and parents probably define as best or meritorious, right? So the messiness that you talk about is because we're not all on the same page. We're not all using the same lingo, and we're not all using the same definitions. And that makes it really hard for us to provide the best quality customer service, for them to create the best strategy for their college search or college admissions process. And I get it. It's not what your audience is likely wanting to hear from someone in our seats, but is the God's honest truth.
Thanks for that, Jay. I appreciate it. I'm not pulling any punches here with Jay, so I appreciate the thoughtful, open and honest answers here. I think it's very helpful for students and families who are listening. So considering all that, I'm curious your opinion. Is college admissions fair?
That's a funny question. I once had a college counselor back in a prior institution when I was, on the ground doing recruiting and building those relationships with counselors and reading all of those files from those schools. I once had a college counselor from an expensive independent prep school tell me, quote, "This decision for this particular candidate just isn't fair." And my reaction, after I choked down my laughter, was, "You've been in this business long enough to know that it isn't going to be fair." That reaction's probably a little strong for the general public. It is fair. It's fair within our processes at our institutions, but our processes and our institutional priorities aren't known in real time by you, the public. So it may be perceived as unfair. And that's kind of what I meant by, we're not all on the same level playing field. We hear all the time, I'm sure you hear it too. I don't know. Does WPI have an early decision program? Binding early decision program? You're on mute, Andy.
2 years into this pandemic and still haven't figured it out. Sorry, you cut out a little bit there.
Does WPI have a binding early decision program?
We do.
Yeah. So how can I, the question we hear all the time is, how can I increase my chances, right? Will early decision increase my chances of admissions? The truth is that's a numbers game that the applicant and their family just cannot play. They don't know our numbers real time, right? Um, so, is it fair? It probably doesn't look fair, but we try so hard to make it fair within our own processes.
I think that's a really honest and straightforward answer. I we get these comments or these questions a lot, and I think it's something we all struggle with because I know for WPI, when we're reviewing our processes, our policies, which really guide a lot of the decisions in conjunction with institutional priorities. Uh, you know, uh, my common response to families is we put a lot of time and energy and thought into making this process as equitable as possible. But when you have twice as many qualified students academically for the number of spots that you can offer, it's not ever going to be fair, because fair in my definition would be giving everyone that opportunity. And we just can't based on the size of our institution or the resources that we have to educate students in the way in which WPI or UVM, promise and commit to educate their students. And so I think that's one of the difficult things about selective admissions is that, you put so much time and energy into things and you expect fairness. I mean, I think that's a reasonable expectation, but at the same time, the system really isn't set up for us to at least have the same definition of fair. But I do think it's a human process, and I think to your point, I think people are trying to be as fair as possible within this human process. That just the numbers do not work out in favor of fairness for all at the end of the day. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you get to you're alluding to the point where we've talked a lot about, especially these past few years, and has only increased over the last two, where we've just seen huge growth in application volume. Competitiveness for admissions is different than eligibility for admission.
Absolutely. So you've brought us inside the admissions committee, and you've really delivered on the podcast promise to our listeners to give them a peek behind the admissions curtain. But what's one additional thing you haven't mentioned so far that you think students and parents don't know about the process that's a secret?
Um, I think it's I think the biggest secret is probably kind of just like the social science that goes behind our processes. It's behavioral economics. All of the data that we look at and analyze, the models that we run our data through, the predicting behavior off of past behaviors, off of prior classes. It may not be a big secret anymore in 2022, Andy, especially as we hear all things about big data all of the time. I think higher ed is often not considered in that conversation. Enrollment has been there for a while. Higher
Sure.
ed is getting there quicker and quicker every day, um, big time. And I think that maybe the students assume that, given the type of students that we're recruiting, this Gen Z student these days. I don't think the parents really consider the big data aspect of our processes.
And how does that influence the process? Where is big data used, and is it at the, as we talk about admissions as a funnel, is it at the top of the funnel as you're trying to reach out to students? Is it in the
Oh,
application review? Is it in yield, trying to enroll students?
I think it's everywhere. We slice and dice our data at every step of the way. So, the emails that you get, as you're building your college list, like those were deliberate and thought out emails. And, you, Andy, in Massachusetts, and me, Jay, in Burlington, Vermont, looking at the same school may get two different emails because we're geographically different, or you've done something or indicated interest in something that's different, right? So I think it's every step of the way, um, uh, including the selection model. We've heard, and there's the buzzword of demonstrated interest out there in the world these days. And one way that we get through this big amount of volume and narrow it down to the students who we admit and enroll, are data points that tell us this student is interested in our institution. Now, that sounds kind of like Big Brother and menacing. I don't think it's, carte blanche, writ large, Big Brother and menacing, right? I think it's more on the margins as we build our processes, and as we get more and more strategic and surgical as we look back on what happened last year and what are we going to do different for next year. But I would say it's pretty permeating throughout the process, from topmost level of the funnel to heck, after you pay your admissions deposit, right? Because we still need to keep you sticky until you show up here on campus.
Wow, you've given us a lot, just in terms of really getting to understand some of the mechanics behind the scenes, some of the decision-making factors. So I really appreciate you, giving everyone that peek behind the curtain. And as someone who reviews applications, but even maybe more importantly, someone who designs the systems through which these applications flow, for our students listening, what advice do you have for them about completing their applications?
My advice to students completing applications are very much kind of what I talked about in my application process at the top of the podcast, which was, enjoy the process. Be somewhat self-reflective throughout the process. Be okay making hard decisions about your future. At the end of the day, just like all of us, and here's the economist coming out in me, we're all trying to make decisions for us using the limited data and information that we have right now today, right? Yep. So at the end of the day, you're going to make the best decision you could have made for yourself today for tomorrow. Wherever you go, that's going to be a great decision, and you're going to make the most of it. And, if you're a student listening to this podcast, you're already in great shape, right? Like, you care enough to listen to this podcast, educate yourself. You're going to make the best decision and make the most out of that decision moving forward.
And finally, for our parent audience, which is probably the largest segment right now, you said it earlier. We as parents, we want what's best for our children. It's especially true when we're thinking about the college application process. And we've all heard a story or two where maybe a parent went a little bit too far. Mom calling, pretending to be your son, dad calling, pretending to be the daughter. Those are some extremes, but what are some of the do's and don'ts you have for parents going through the process to keep this a healthy, student-driven process, but that also allows them to put in some guardrails and some support?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a number of your guests give great advice to parents over your past few episodes. I mean, do be involved in the student's process. Don't be overly involved in your student's process, right? I forgot who gave you this piece of advice, but we've heard it I've heard it from a couple of different people. Carve out that 1 hour or 90 minutes a week at the dinner table, right, to talk all things college and nowhere else during the week, just so you don't hammer it too hard. My biggest piece of advice, and this was kind of going back to the question about the secret and big data involved in the process, is control your controllables and forget the rest. All you can do is help your student put their best candidacy forward, and then let the chips fall where they may. And again, if you do that homework at the front end and you put your effort into the application process, the chips are going to fall in pretty good spots, and you're going to have a hard decision on your hands, which is better than an easy decision or no decision at all, which is, which one of these great places do I attend?
That's great advice, Jay. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Inside Admission podcast. Really a pleasure to have you.
Enjoying the podcast? Like and subscribe to this YouTube video. You can also find us on the web at InsideAdmissionPodcast.com, and you can find and engage with us on social media, where our handle is Inside Admission on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.